Dear spectators, I wish you welcome to this lecture series on the life and work of composer Richard Wagner. These lectures are given now at the University of Helsinki in the building Topelia, and these can be followed by any student of musicology or anyone interested in our European musical heritage, and especially about Richard Wagner. I have prepared a schedule of these lectures, which consists of 7 items altogether, and I shall follow this plan, maybe not so rigorously, but I can make some changes, but in principle. And I can tell you in advance now in this first lecture what will be coming, so that you know how to follow. To follow this class does not presuppose any special courses before of music theory or even semiotics, if you like, but you can just follow with your interest. And I'm using also as illustration rather much pictures and also some very old filmic materials, documentary films, and then I shall play myself music and analyze it, especially in the last part of the lectures. But now my 7 points are simply, if I list you here, they are: first, why Wagner, the most studied composer of the world, I would say. Why should he be studied once again? And second, I try to somehow define or establish the so-called position of the scholar, so that concerns myself. So I'm sorry, I have to speak about myself, but you must be aware of my special viewpoint and approach to Richard Wagner in order to understand what I'm going to say. So I shall tell you about my life with Wagner, if I make a paraphrase of Christian Thieleman's book, Mein Leben mit Wagner. Third, I shall say a few words about methodology of my study, because it is mostly in the analytic part what I call semiotical study, first based by the so-called Paris school of semiotics, and then especially by the so-called existential semiotics, which is my own theory, which I've been developing for many time already. Then fourth point are the sources. What are the sources of my study? And there I mentioned just the most important books and other sources. And then fifth one is the life calendar of Richard Wagner. So I shall go through his life, its most important phases, and just paying attention to certain decisive moments which we need to know in order to understand his work. And sixth is his output, writings, which are enormous quantity, but to which I shall not pay much attention in this lecture series. And I have quite full reason, because I don't think they are quite interesting. I'm sorry to say, if you are very passionate Wagnerian, but you know, Wagner pretended to be a great philosopher of music, but he was not. So his writings were done for other purposes. He needed them psychologically for his own construction, and they are of course fascinating as a picture of the time. But the most serious mistake which we might make while studying Wagner is to think that Wagner, the composer, would have followed his theories as a writer. That is absolutely not true, unfortunately. Because in opera, which is of course his main field, he was completely either a theater man. He always thought how that looks on the stage or as a theater, and then of course he was composer. It has been said that until turn of the century, I mean the First World War, his operas were taken as a theater in the first place, but nowadays certainly the reason why we go to opera to hear Parsifal or Tristan or Mastersingers is the music, definitely. That is the reason why he's living reality, why he's so terribly fascinating still. So I mean, I shall not deal much with writings, but then with music, and I shall try to say something about each phase of his compositions. First, the early operas Rienzi, Tannhäuser, and Lohengrin. Rienzi, which is not often performed and very little known, but however, whose some melodies show already the Wagner we know. If I play you just, let's say, the Rienzi's prayer, this melody, we can say that their Wagner is Wagner, maybe for the first time. I shall play you just a short fragment, and this is coming from the Franz Liszt complete piano transcriptions of Richard Wagner, which I'm using very much. Although I must tell you frankly that Franz Liszt was not quite successful with his Wagner arrangements. He was much better with his Beethoven symphonies, to say the truth. But anyway, we have this. Of course, we have a lot of piano arrangements which we can use to illustrate some theories and analyses. The best ones I've discovered are, one is by this Louis Brassin. He was a pianist. He published a lot of which are very pianistic, and then quite masterful in this book, this August Stradal, Ausgewählte Wagner Transkriptionen. But anyway, Rienzi, der Wagner is Wagner. Here is typical, this andante, which is just a typically German tempo. That was said by famous art educator Langben in his book Rembrandt als Erzieher in the Wagnerian period. So it's andante, is typically German tempo. And then typically is this harmonization, so that you have for every note of the melody you have different chords. So this was method which Theodor Adorno later criticized, that it's very school-like manner to harmonize melodies. But it is typical of Wagner, and even later analysts like I think the American Tuttle in his very interesting study on Richard Wagner says that Wagner followed always these strict household rules of harmonies and tonal progress. So that is Rienzi. Then, of course, Tannhäuser, he was maybe one of the first successes, but also scandalous by its Paris performance, which was total failure 1861. And then Lohengrin, of course, which is already on these German historical, mythological sources. But then comes, of course, the maybe major issue, maybe the Nibelungen ring, the tetralogy, which was his great work, 4 operas to be performed consecutively. So the Rhinegold, the Walküre, Siegfried, and Götterdämmerung, which had the plot which put them together, and whose idea maybe came from the Greek tragedy Aeschylus and Euripides, and these who wrote also a series of dramas. So that is certainly major thing in which he fully utilized this old Scandinavian and German mythology, Edda Sagor, and other sources, but provided always these with romantic psychological context, so that his heroes, they are no longer those mute, archaic people like Thomas Mann once said, but they follow rather the psychology of the 19th century novel protagonist, one could say. So, and that is very typical. That, like if Wagner quoted Wolfram von Eschenbach, the famous German old medieval writer, then in Parsifal, then certainly what the people really think and do and feel on stage, it's totally different. It is our time, certainly. Anyway, Nibelungen, which I studied previously in my dissertation, Myth and Music, which appeared already 1979 in Berlin, Mouton de Gruyter, and then also in French, Myth et Musique, Edition de Moll in Paris, and then one study on Die Walküre, the second act, fourth scene, so-called Todesverkündigungsszene, which I studied with strictly semiotical method by Paris School, i.e. Greimas, so to say. And then, moreover, I shall pay attention in this phase for the very special composing techniques which Richard Wagner developed for this huge opera to hold it together, namely so-called leitmotif techniques, so leitmotifs. Leitmotifs, as we know, they were those short motifs which represented events, feelings, acts, persons on stage, and whereby he could really create quite coherent musical and dramatical continuity in his dramas. However, his pupils later in Bayreuth, they systematized these leitmotifs, and they published or used to publish at the beginning of the piano scores leitmotif tables, diagrams, in which all the leitmotifs of the opera, they were listed and classified and named by titles. Wagner himself never accepted this. He said to Cosima, his wife, later in Wannsee, that is crazy. People really think that I have invented so funny thing. I never thought of that. Anyway, it is true that there are leitmotifs, and there are just about 200 leitmotifs for Nibelungen, and there are full reasons why there is just this amount. But I shall discuss this more in the passage for Nibelungen. But then, as you know, the composing was interrupted between Siegfried's second and third act. There were 10 years pause, during which Wagner wrote his Tristan und Isolde and Mastersingers, so two completely different operas and topics. And this certainly influenced the whole musical style of the end of Nibelungen, which is characterized by very heavy orchestra and very dark timbre, we could say. It is this düstere Abblendung des Klanges, like Theodor Adorno said. So that is the fact about the impact. But of course, Tristan, I have to deal separately. Tristan, we started the crisis of the romantic harmony, like the Swiss psychologist Ernst Kurt put it, and which is so important in Wagner's whole output. Many people who otherwise don't accept Wagner at all, they accept at least Tristan as something quite special. And then, of course, come Mastersinger, the Mastersingers, which is the only comedy he wrote. That's something you have to remember. Everything is comic and comedy in Mastersinger. So it's paradoxical that this opera became a symbol of German patriotism and German national feelings as early as in the war between Prussia and France in 1871. But originally it was definitely a comedy, and you have to see in that light the whole music and plot. And then comes at the end maybe the top of all, it is the Parsifal, his last opera. Based on the old story, he combined many ideas for his interesting woman figure, their Kundry, which is some kind of erring Jew, which is endlessly searching for his salvation, so to say. And then Parsifal, who is some kind of religious figure, but not the same as Jesus Christ, not all. You must remember that Wagner was interested in Buddhist philosophy very strongly, thanks to Schopenhauer, and this had a great impact on his operas already on Nibelungen Ring. And this Buddhist idea, this search for die Erlösung, reconciliation, so to say, is the major theme in Parsifal. And Parsifal, of course, is maybe in the history of opera something quite unique. It was Bühnenweihfestspiel, so it was the sacred stage work which Wagner thought should be performed only in Bayreuth, in the theater which he had constructed for the purpose of performing only his work. So Wagner family tried to keep this copyright, but they failed rather quickly. So when Metropolitan Opera, however, did it in the early 20th century. So that is his output, which I shall then try to deal with some detail and some approaches. And then the seventh, the last section is about Wagnerism, which was a general European cultural phenomenon which expanded to all European countries, not only Germany, but it was very strong in France and Italy, for instance, also in Russia and even in Finland. We cannot understand Jean Sibelius without Wagner, although Sibelius never liked this comparison. He said that no, I never heard Wagner seriously, but it's not true because Sibelius also visited Bayreuth and had a great impact. And there are many aspects in Sibelius which are stemming from Wagnerian sources. And also in Finland there were other Wagnerians, and that's fascinating. And by the way, there is this anecdote or story that Richard Wagner would have visited Finland, namely Imatra waterfall, which is in the eastern part of Finland and very famous when Finland was autonomous part of Russia. So it was very popular that the Russian emperors and empresses could visit from St. Petersburg, Imatra, just to see the waterfall, which was so powerful. And so there was a story that Richard Wagner would have visited it in 1864 during his journey to St. Petersburg and Moscow. And this story goes that is the fact, namely that they discovered a poem, an engraving on the lower pavilion of the river Vuoksi, Imatra. This was a poem in French which said something that you noble Sarmat, so Sarmat they were Russians, you understand my divine art when Paris was whistling to it. I shall write an opera of the river, and there will be some heroes like fishes and trees of the area. But then the whole Finland believed that this river is certainly Imatra and Vuoksi, and they published in Borgobladet, in the newspaper, a news about this fact. So disappointment was big when Rhinegold was premiered, and they knew that it was Rhine River and not Finland just. But this was discussed later, but we don't know simply whether Wagner was here or not, but let us return that later. So I shall have 7 parts altogether, and in the first part, or the second one, I promise to tell you something of the position of the scholar. So about myself, I'm sorry I have to deal with it. We must a bit contextualize this situation. However, I'm a Finnish scholar, and there is certain reasons how a Finnish person can become Wagnerian, how that was possible when I was quite young in 1960s and maybe late 50s, because you must notice that the Finnish culture was, before the Second World War, very strongly German-oriented. And so Wagner was performing our opera in Helsinki much. But then after war, we stopped radically, and Wagner disappeared totally from the Finnish cultural scene. This meant that such a young boy as me, a 12 years old boy, me and my classmate, Professor Rhinegold, we had very little opportunities to hear anything of Wagner. I could play an easy arrangement for young pianists from a booklet, one melody, which is one of his most popular tunes. So it is the famous Pilgrim's chorus from Tannhäuser. So. This melody is andante, German tempo, maestoso, and then just this transition to the repetition when it comes very powerfully is very typically a theatrical gesture. I would say that no classical composer, Beethoven and others, they could not write, because it is a little bit in the limit of what is vulgar theatrical style, namely this but it is terribly impressive, certainly, and certainly to impress people, make an impact or effect was very important for Wagner in all his music. So Tannhäuser was very much in use in my young years. But then later I got my first LP recordings because I got from one German Wagner. My mother, who was pianist and moved with women gymnastic groups in Germany for performances, met there one German enthusiast gentleman who heard about a 12-year-old boy in Finland who loved Wagner. So he donated me 2 records, which were my first recordings of Wagner. They were Arturo Toscanini conducting the Parsifal, Good Friday Music and Ouverture, and then Hans Knappertsbusch conducted Mastersingers Ouverture. So my classmate Hannu had some other recordings, but we had very little this sound resources at that time, because in the radio, in Finnish Broadcasting Company, we never heard almost Wagner. It was not in the repertoire at all, I would say. So it was very seldom, and in an opera there was very seldom any Wagner performances. Now then, in the university I heard in the lectures of my teacher Eero Tarasti, he spoke about Wagner, and I heard first time the Rhinegold Ouverture Prelude, which is so terribly impressive with its E-flat major chord expanding from the low bass clarinet to the highest, to the full range of the orchestra. So I got some information, but otherwise it was very little. And in fact, we got even gramophone player in the 1950s only. So it was and the first record was not Wagner, it was Mozart 40th Symphony, which the Anton mother Alma Sahlsten donated us. Now, Alma Sahlsten had been in Paris with her sister Anna, painter, and heard the Walküre in Paris Opera in 1897 and wrote to Finland that that was really terrific, that it was real fire on stage you would have been scared to see that she wrote to her Finnish relatives. But anyway, then Bayreuth, which is the place in which Wagner then built his famous theater, I visited only once in 1993 with my wife Eila. And so I saw their 4 performances. I saw stagings by Werner Herzog, Lohengrin, Heiner Müller, the Flying Dutchman, and then by Wolfgang Wagner, Parsifal, namely, and of course to see Bayreuth is a great experience because it has been able to keep the atmosphere as it was in Wagner's time. And as you know, all in that house had been planned by Richard himself, the acoustics and with all details with the old 100 years old wood materials and everything, which make it just so fantastic. Then a little bit later, 3 years later, I visited Neuschwanstein, which is a very famous place in Germany. Namely, it is the place of the castles of Ludwig II, Louis II, who was great benefactor and protector of Richard Wagner, who really changed his whole life suddenly from the desperate state of exile into prosperity and fulfillment of all his dreams, indeed. So Neuschwanstein is a Wagnerian castle close to Munich, now the biggest tourist center of the whole Germany, bringing much money, but in the time of Louis II, it was a catastrophe for Bavaria's economy and cost that Ludwig was put from his. He had to abdicate and had very sad story. I shall tell this later in the chapter about in Wagner's life. So Neuschwanstein I saw, and it's an impressive document or monument, rather I would say, of Wagnerism. Although Louis never thought that it would be a monument of himself. No, he just wanted to create an environment which was Wagnerian and which he would like to stay. But he stayed only 8 months there when these dramatic events took place and he had to leave his crown. So Neuschwanstein, and then my first study was my doctoral thesis, Myth and Music, based on French Claude Lévi-Strauss and his ideas. And by the way, Lévi-Strauss was also a great admirer of Wagner's music and said it several times in his works. And I studied namely the 3 significant operas or musical works, Wagner's Siegfried, Sibelius' Kullervo Symphony, and Stravinsky's Oedipus Rex, which had a similar kind of heroic story as the basis. And so even there Wagner was important. But also in other senses, namely what was the mythical and all these varieties and how they manifested in Wagner's work. That was my theme. Then I have continued my Wagner studies separately. Of course, in my sources were some performances. Very impressive was Patrick Chéreau's staging of Nibelungen Ring in the 1970s from Bayreuth. It was a radical change and reform of the old stage tradition in Wagner, but which is still, I would say, the perfect way to modernize Wagner, if you like, and just preserving the basic ideas of Richard Wagner. So Patrick Chéreau's staging was very fascinating, and so I studied just this the Walküre scene with Gwyneth Jones as Brünnhilde and Peter Hoffmann as Siegmund, and this very impressive scene, highly dramatic and typical of Wagnerian techniques. Now then, I published in 1990 my first novel, whose title is very Wagnerian, Le Secret de Professeur Amfortas. Now, Amfortas, of course, if you know, is reference to one of the heroes of Parsifal. He's the suffering king who has the wound which is never healing, and so then Parsifal comes and helps him indeed. So, but anyway, my novel was science fiction and took place in future state called Americana, but it is completely Wagnerian. There are quotations of Parsifal and main figures like, let's say, piano virtuoso Gudrune Kundrisdotter is from Kundry from Parsifal, and the very evil professor Rosknilk is Klingsor, is anagram, turn the word other way, and Professor Titurel. So it's an academic campus novel taking place in one university in this state of Americana, which are called semiogenic. It is dominated by science and women, but it's completely Wagnerian. And so now, I published also in Berlin at Mouton a book about semiotics of classical music, how Mozart, Brahms, and Wagner talk to us. And there are some ideas of Wagner, and also my study on Wagnerian leitmotifs technique, how that functions really. And now I'm just on the pressure to write my really big book on Wagner, which I've been doing all my life, so I hope to finally complete it. So that is my point of view, I would say. So what I try to say with my Wagner study, I just try to clarify or elucidate where lies his charm and his fascination, which is so evident still. So and so, how to say, not strange, but unusual, uncommon, that a composer from 100 years ago or even more can still evoke so strong feelings, both for and against, we have to say as well. Now my methodology, my analysis, maybe I go to methodology more when it comes to the analysis, because that's clear, because I don't want to give here a course on semiotics, neither on Paris School nor on my existential semiotics, but certainly that is a background theory which explains my Wagner study, because, as I told you, Wagner is the most studied and researched composer of the whole world ever, definitely. And so if you write something about Wagner, there must be full reason to try to say something new. And I think that you must have some kind of method, new method, to find some new content of his music and what it is, what his essence is after all. Then the fourth thing here is certainly are the sources. What are those? Because my sources are very diverse. I've been gathering them for a rather long time by visiting libraries and archives in Germany, but also in other universities, even from Minnesota to Bloomington. By the way, no one knows that Wagner wanted to move to Minnesota in his late life, to Minneapolis. He was absolutely, because he was so disappointed with what happened in Germany in his late life when Germany became finally unified and became Germany, but he was not satisfied what happened there under Bismarck and Emperor. And so he planned to go to Minnesota. Anyway, I found in Minnesota a wonderful Wagner library, which I could then use in my own work. But I would say that absolutely the most important source is his autobiography, Mein Leben, My Life. We have it fortunately in Finland as a very good Finnish translation, but of course it is also in English, My Life, and in many other languages of the world. So I would recommend highly everyone who wants to know something about the European musical culture to read this book. It is not, how would I say, not too serious or boring. It is very humorous, I would say. Wagner had a very strong sense of humor of Sachs, of that German count or region in which he lived. And his wife Cosima said that later that Wagner's life had been so difficult that without this sense of humor, he would never have gone through all he had to go through. So I mean that this Mein Leben is absolutely worthwhile to read, and it is a very living picture of the whole musical Europe of the time, and he talks much about other composers and cultural phenomena of his time. He wrote it, the first impulse was to write it for his king Ludwig II, Louis II. But of course he wrote it also for his children, especially for his son Siegfried, to tell something about their father. But he stopped it in the year about 1868 or so, or even earlier. And what he continued was another book called Das Braune Buch, the Brown Book, of which they made edition deluxe with beautiful engravings and decorations. And there he wrote his notes, which contain many valuable information about his philosophies, especially about his relation with Hinduism and the Buddhist philosophy, which he quite seriously studied in many phases of his life. So he wrote about Brahma and Atma. He speaks about Atma, which is the Dämmerung and music. He says it is not asthma, so he was always joking a little bit, but it is Atma, the soul of the music. And I must say that we must take that seriously, and I take it myself seriously in my new theory of existential semiotics as well, in my quite fresh essay, which I'm just now finishing, namely Existential Semiotics as a Metaphysical System. Anyway, then the fourth very important source is Die Tagebücher, the diaries by Cosima Wagner, who was his second wife. Wagner's first wife was an actress, Minna Planer, with whom he was married a long time until his exile to Switzerland. But Cosima then came to his life, and Cosima, as you know, was daughter of Franz Liszt and the Countess Marie Dagoult from Paris. And so that's another story altogether. Cosima's diaries are really important because he started from 1869 and wrote daily, really. There are 4 volumes until 1883, until the passing away of Richard. So every day of Richard has been portrayed in this wonderful document, I would say. So he starts always how Richard had slept his night, whether he was healthy or ill, what was his feelings, what did he say in the breakfast table, how did he withdrew for composing. He made promenades, walks, he was playing with the children, he visited other places, he met friends, wrote letters, and staged his operas and received guests to Bayreuth, to Wahnfried. So every day has been described quite carefully. Well, later scholars have said that maybe what Cosima is telling is not always quite true. Maybe he was just a little bit changing the truth to make it look better. But maybe that is true. We know that, for instance, Wagner's Meinleben book Cosima gave to one of her daughters, Eva, to be read and then to be destroyed after that. But then Eva did not destroy it, fortunately. Instead, Eva destroyed only some pages which she thought were compromising in the story. And maybe Cosima did not tell everything, because Wagner, as you know, had love affairs with women all his life systematically. So certainly that was something which was not proper to tell in the diary. But anyway, there are absolutely wonderful notes, Richard's opinions about other composers, Beethoven, Bach, how musicians like Joseph Rubinstein, pianist, played Bach das Walküre mit Klavier in Wahnfried, and about philosophy, history, about literature, Goethe, Schiller, everything is there. And certainly Cosima had no reason to falsify the truth, what Wagner said about these composers. And so I think that is still very serious source for any Wagner research, and I'm using it myself very much. Now then, we have many documents and reports on Wagner. I would say that the older they are, the more valuable they are to my mind. So the closer they are to Wagner's own time, the better. The more authentic is the atmosphere of the comments, and especially I appreciate two men. One was his assistant, Heinrich Borges, who was a journalist and editor of the famous musical magazine in Germany, and later joined Wagner and assisted the Bayreuth performances and wrote his notes from how Wagner staged himself. What did he do? That is extremely valuable. Borges wrote every day and every act which were Wagner's advice to do that, and that is something we have to read. And I think every modern contemporary stage director should read that, and especially if you go to score the small indications in which Wagner writes what happens on stage. They should be followed and not forgotten, definitely, because Wagner saw it so clearly. So I mean, Heinrich Borges is very exciting. And the other one was the ballet master Fricke, who came to teach the actors how to move elegantly on stage and how to perform the dances. And even a man who gave dance lessons to Wagner family and the children. So Fricke also kept a diary and told many exciting things. But then there are many other books. Some are very scandalous, like one huge anthology of all the nicknames and all the insults against Wagner used in his time. And one psychiatrist who wrote very early the case of Wagner as a psychiatric case and such publication. But they have all their own value in the series of these documents. Moreover, we have the recordings, of course, which are very important source. If I will mention only one conductor whom I appreciate very highly, he is, of course, VII Wagner, who has recorded, fortunately, very much Wagner, and during those difficult years in 1930s and 40s. But they are absolutely wonderful, because his vision of Wagner is just the right one. Also, musically, his tempos, they are just what they have to be, and they are just unique in that sense. Now then, about singers, if I give you a list which are my preferences, they are certainly Kirsten Flagstad, the Norwegian soprano, who was singing much Wagner, and she didn't sing in Bayreuth in the 1940s, but she sang then later in Metropolitan. From her we have one quite funny fragment from a Bob Hope show for New York, in which she on stage singing Brünnhilde's Hoyot Ho, this famous Walküre motif as a part of that American show. It is, but she has the quality, namely she has the strength of the voice, but also lightness. Wagner must never sound very heavy and so to say, and rough and rude. Never. It must be always pleasant and nice. And we must remember that Wagner himself admired bel canto, Italian bel canto. He said, even in his most national-minded essay, Was ist Deutsch in der Musik, that Germany got the music from Italy, after all. And so he used himself bel canto in the most impressive culminations of his operas, like in the Nibelungen Ring, let's say when Siegfried sings about future Siegfried, and then when Brünnhilde, and then of course the love duet in Götterdämmerung, beginning between Siegfried and Brünnhilde, it has that one bel canto. So bel canto appears always when Wagner wants to say something which is very, very emotional, eloquent and very impressive. So I mean that the singer must have this quality, and it is like he said to in these Bayreuth directions, that the singer is like a boat on a sea, And the sea can be very, very rough and very, very heavy, but be stormy, but the boat must never sink down. So the sea also must carry the singer, whose voice must be heard, always there. Then, of course, the other soprano is Birgit Nilsson, who is unforgettable, of course. And about the male singers, number one is absolutely Max Lorenz. And about Max Lorenz, I want to tell later. I want to show you later the only film fragment we have of Max Lorenz, who was a big star in 1930s and 40s, and who has, I think, the most authentic Wagner style, which you must hear his recording from Winterstürme Wichen dem Wonnemont from Berlin, 1926, already when he was quite young. But by the way, Max Lorenz was the only Bayreuth singer who was allowed to continue his career after the war, maybe when the Bayreuth was reopened 1952. He was the only one, and there were full reason why he was allowed to do that. So, and then of course we have Matti Salminen, our Finnish great bass singer, who is a great star in Germany and all over the world, and who sings this Hunding role and Gurnemans and many other Wagnerian roles so wonderfully. Now other sources are of course cinema, film. There is one thick study about Wagner in film, which I have here. It is the It is a study by Sabine Sonntag, Richard Wagner im Kino, Studien zur Geschichte, Dramaturgie und Rezeption filmmusikalischer Künstlerbiografien. And he discusses deals with the most important Wagner films, which we have many. Of course, everyone knows Ludwig Visconti's Ludwig II, Ludwig der Zweite, which is has a shorter and longer version, which is classical. But then, of course, some may know the German Züberberg, Hans-Jürgen Züberberg, who made a lot Wagnerian films, like about Parsifal, and also one film about Ludwig II, Requiem für einen jungfräulichen König, is that. And then, from 1954, I discovered one film by Keutner about Ludwig, which is not known at all. But I must say that the most important among all these films is the one made by Karl Fröhlich, producer Messner, from the year 1913. So that is perhaps to my mind also the best composer film ever done. And note, it was a mute film. There is no speech, there is only background music. The year of filming is decisive, 1913. This means the word actors portray and how they behave on stage, their gestures, their habitus, is still the La Belle Époque, we say, the old world of Wagner of the 19th century. Then came the First World War and everything changed, became terrible and rude. So all this old world was lost, and that's why this film is extremely valuable. And if you study Wagner's operas and their performances, you must carefully look those short scenes which show Wagner stagings from that time, because they are certainly looking like something which Wagner was really at the end of the 19th century, I would say. So this Karl Fröhlich film is important, and I want to, in my go-to Wagner's life calendar, his biography, I want to illustrate it by some fragments from this movie, which had music, but music could not be Wagner because of copyright. 1913, Cosima was alive and would have taken enormous money for any use of Wagner's melodies. So the composer and main actor Becke wrote his own music, which is almost like Wagner. So that, but always when it comes too close, it goes its own way. So it gives us an illusion to be in a kind of Wagnerian atmosphere, and it is rather fantastic. In the film fragment I discovered later, there is this music by piano, of course. Piano accompaniment has been orchestrated, and it is no longer quite the same. It will be by piano, like in the mute films, indeed. So they had seen in Berliner cultural life a young man, Becce, Italian origin, who was an artist and many-sided personality, who was absolutely looking like Richard Wagner. Many people came to tell to him that, are you aware that you are just like copy of Richard Wagner? And so Messler wanted to have just this type of person, and Becce was also a composer. So this means that the music of the film was partly stemming from Wagner's motives, which were made unrecognizable by improvisation, then by Becce's own music, and at the end, quotations of Mozart, Beethoven, Rossini, and other popular tunes, like in revolutionary portrayal of Dresden, they use Marseillaise as a symbol of revolution. So the musical scene is rather exciting, although it is only by piano. Now then, this film was done just for Richard's 100th birthday, 1913, and it was much expected and also much criticized. But truth is that all the actors, they are very much looking like the originals. The only person who is different is Cosima, because Cosima was alive, and so maybe they consciously they chose a different type to act him. But otherwise, the atmosphere is just correct, I would say. So we have a lot of these documents, but now we might go to Wagner's life and life calendar and think about what happened on him. Of course, in every Wagner biography, you have normally you have the schedule of most important events, but of Wagner, you must know that he developed rather slowly. So he was not any young child prodigy at all, but his father was theater man, but died very early, and then Ludwig Geyer took the family, who was also an actor, and Geyer said when Wagner was some 8 years old that Richard certainly has some talent, and this is shown, by the way, in the movie rather nicely, how when young Richard is playing something. Now then, the first musical training for Richard was the Thomaskirche cantor Thomas Weinlich, who had a perfect classical education, pupil of Padre Martini in Bologna, Italy, and who learned Wagner to write learned style fugues and very classical forms. So at the end, Wagner was able to write a three-part fugue, which was so good that Weinlich put it on hanging on the wall and said that it could be as well done by myself. So Wagner had this very traditional education, which is important. Later, he never wrote any fugues in his operas. He uses fugues only for chaotic moments of his dramas, like Walküre third act, when the Walküres, they are almost screaming, afraid of Wotan, who is arriving to punish Brünnhilde. Or then in Mastersingers, in the Midsummer Night battle or fight on street, then it is also total chaos. It's like fugal part. So otherwise, Wagner never used this baroque. Otherwise, he adapted some gallant style topics and also baroque style, like so-called Doppelschlag, this ornamentation, which is often part of some melody, like of Brünnhilde, Siegfried, Rienzi's prayer, and many other moments in his music. Anyway, Wagner learned these topics, which, as we know, is a very important part of the classical style, and they appear in his music, like the learned style, gallant style, all the dances, dance forms, folk style, and many other such features, or military calls, or pastoral style, or galloping horses, even if we think of Walküren Ritt, Walküren Ride. So they are just the horses riding there in this terribly powerful musical passage altogether. So Wagner had this musical training, but also he was in theater all the time, because all his family, they were in theater, and so it was long time certain that Richard would also become some kind of theater person, an actor. His dream was certainly to become an actor. Now later we have young German musicologist or theater scholar Martin Knust, who has studied Wagner as a dramaturg, and who has just clarified Wagner's relation with the acting of his time. We must notice that at that time there was no serious education of actors in theater in Germany, or serious training of even singers in Germany at all. So, but Richard was part of that life, and he followed just plays and dramas in his hometown. Then he was very sensitive, but he could never become an actor for the simple reason, two reasons. He was physically too short. Actors were all quite tall persons, especially male actors. And then his speech was not proper. He spoke too fast. He was swallowing the ends of the phrases, so that later his expression was so unclear that in Bayreuth they couldn't follow what was his intention to be said. Instead, he was physically acrobatic, and he could jump on stage from some loge and to show how that should be performed by the singers. So actor's job profession was impossible for him, and gradually he more and more moved towards the music. He had also a kind of university studies, but he never succeeded in philosophy or any other. He was amateur in all those respects. His first wife, Minna Planer, was an actress, and so Wagner learned much from this first wife. And in fact, all the major ideas of his operas matured when he was married with Minna. He divorced then in 1864, something like that, and but then already he had created essentially all the ideas in his mind of his future operas. By the way, we must notice that Wagner planned and wrote and composed these operas simultaneously, not one after the other. So all these operas, they lived Tannhäuser, Lohengrin, Mastersingers, Tristan, even Parsifal, they were in rather early phase, a kind of ideal level in his mind. That's important. And he also knows how many operas he will altogether compose in his life. He became a conductor of orchestras rather young also, and got important assignments as an opera conductor, and could make his living as just a director of small wandering theater groups. His life was very wandering indeed, and he took a post first in Riga, Latvia, as a conductor of the opera. So he moved with Minna to Riga, and left there some traces of later Wagnerism, but he had to soon escape because he was indebted economically seriously to many directions, and his indebtors were persecuting him, and so he had to secretly escape over the borderline very dramatically and take a boat from Latvia to Norway, planning to go to England. So he started this later famous trip by boat under a very stormy sea, he was in a very heavy storm, so heavy storm that they were bound by ropes in the boat, in order not to fall down in the waves. By the way, it's very funny that he mentions one very silent sailorman whom Wagner's dog Robert did not like at all, and this sailorman was called Kosk. So I must think that he was a Finn, Koski probably. Otherwise, there are very few Finns in his life. Now, anyway, when the boat finally was saved and arrived at Norway coast, they could get to harbor, and there Wagner heard the sailors shouting some calls, which became first motifs of the Flying Dutchman. That is certainly quite true, that the Flying Dutchman the idea was born under these conditions. Now then, from Norway, he continued his journey to London, and then from London, ultimately to Paris, which was the main goal and aim of his life, because he thought that in Paris he could make a big career as an opera composer. He was already planning his first operas like Die Feen, Liebesverbot, and Rienzi, and he thought that Giacomo Meyerbeer would help him from his position as a director of Paris Opera. So he met Meyerbeer and many other Parisian musical notorieties, but his life was quite miserable economically. He was able to make his living only by writing some articles to German music magazines about Parisian musical life, and then make piano arrangements or orchestra arrangements of Italian operas like from Donizetti. So this caused him a great aversion against Italian music. And by the way, he had this aversion already as a very young boy when he heard some Italian sopranos singing very, very loudly Italian opera arias. So, but I would say that this was important school for Wagner to get familiar with Italian opera tradition altogether. And in Paris, he also heard orchestra. For instance, he heard first time, he said, Beethoven's Ninth Symphony performed in the manner it had to be performed. He had never heard it in Germany performed in that manner, like in Paris. So orchestras were in so high level. And of course, he met also Hector Berlioz, who was already a big name in Paris, and heard Berlioz' orchestra pieces. And he wrote in his Mein Leben that, I must admit, I'm only a schoolboy in the side of Berlioz, but Berlioz is making with his orchestra. So he admitted that he had much to learn from this composer and his masterful orchestration. But Parisian life was really very sad, because he had no money for living, and not even for heating his house. We can follow his life from the Quartier Latin, where he lived in several houses, and now there are plaques in the walls of these places. At the end, he decided to leave Paris, and in Germany he was offered a post in Dresden court as a director of its orchestra of the Dresden Duke. And now first time his life get more established. He got a salary, permanent salary, and he was able to conduct significant opera works, and he became some kind of rather well-known conductor. He was able to establish a beautiful library, which he then later lost in his life, but he had rather good life. Anyway, even that was ruined, because in 1848, Das tolle Jahr in Europe, the crazy year of revolutions. It saw the revolution in Paris, and it expanded to other parts of Europe, and also in Dresden. And in Dresden, because he was also intellectual, he was reading the Feuerbach, and Feuerbach's new interpretation of Bible and religion, and also philosophy. He got familiar with the revolutionary ideas about Mikhail Bakunin, the Russian anarchist who came to Dresden in 1849 to make a rebellion, a revolution in Dresden. So they became kind of friends, but Wagner tells in his Mein Leben that he was at the same time quite frightened by the personality of Bakunin, who was very violent in his ideology. He thought that the old world should be destroyed and burned altogether so that the new would come up. And Bakunin said that he would accept only such opera in which one man was singing that we must hang him, another one is singing we must kill him, and so very dramatically. So Wagner was frightened but also fascinated by Bakunin. Then started the Dresden revolution, and Wagner was with August Röckel, his friend, was part of the revolutionary people, and he was able to escape just in the last moment, not to be arrested, because otherwise he would be imprisoned or even doomed to death sentence. He was able to escape, and he escaped, left Germany for Switzerland, where his good friend Franz Liszt, the great piano virtuoso, helped him economically and paid his bills and protected Wagner. And now started his life in the exile. It was still quite pitiful, without any income whatsoever. But he settled in Luzern and ultimately got to live in a house called Triebschen. This Triebschen house, by the way, exists still. It is a museum which you can see. And in Triebschen he also met Friedrich Nietzsche, the young philosopher who had just became professor of philology in Basel University. Nietzsche was still quite young, but he was admirer of Wagner and wrote maybe his first important philosophical tractate, Die Geburt der Tragödie aus dem Geiste der Musik. So the birth of tragedy from the spirit of music. And Nietzsche came to Triebschen to see Wagner, and they had a lot of discussion because Wagner on his side had already published his major aesthetical treatise, Oper und Drama, in which Wagner sketched how his opera should be. Anyway, when Nietzsche read his own book to Wagner, Wagner was dissatisfied because his role was too minor and he was too little mentioned there. Anyway, this book by Nietzsche is important because there Nietzsche launches his famous dichotomy of the Apollonian and Dionysian art, this Rausch und Traum, so ecstasy and dream art. So Dionysian was ecstatic art and the Apollonian was dreamlike art. And had many principles which Wagner followed, like that there is always in suffering some joy, and that every dissonance could be also beautiful, not only consonance. And Nietzsche spoke also the ancient tragedy, and he spoke about a Socratic man who was unable to understand mythical music. So for Nietzsche, the bad thing was Italian opera, like the arias and the recitativo, which followed the spirit of Socratic man who wanted to understand the words. That was not important in real opera, which was symphonic and which was more based on other factors. So they started their friendship, which later, as you know, Nietzsche became adversary of Wagner and published his book there, Fall Wagner und Götterdämmerung and many others, and at the end could not accept at all Wagnerian aesthetics. Wagner's life was rather chaotic indeed because of his woman adventures. He lived, in fact, in the house of banker Wesendonck, whose wife Mathilde Wesendonck became a close friend to Wagner and he is beloved. Mathilde wrote poems, and Wagner wrote his Wesendonck Lieder based on these poems, which were then in fact sketches for Tristan, and from which he moved directly many seems like in Treibhaus as the melodies of Tristan. So that was rather catastrophic. So he was living in this was a triangle drama, the banker, his wife, and Wagner. And then happened that they got the visit of Hans von Bülow. Now, Hans von Bülow was the favorite pupil pianist of Franz Liszt, big master indeed in piano, and also conductor, and a kind of Wagnerian, so he admired Wagner's music. And Hans von Bülow was married with the daughter of Liszt and Marie Dagoult from Paris, Cosima. Hans von Bülow lived in Berlin with Cosima, and they had 2 children, and they came for a visit to Luzern, to Wesendonck House, and immediately Cosima and Richard, they got in love with each other. It started there. And it developed very quickly, and ultimately there was Mathilde, Cosima, and Richard, and then also a certain lady in Munich whom Wagner proposed that she should come to take his household. So there were many women simultaneously in his prospect. At the end, Richard and Cosima, they lived together, and they had their first children still in the marriage with Bülow, and they lived in Tribschen just. And Tribschen became famous because Wagner was already very well-known name in Europe. You must remember that Wagner was much more known as a polemical writer of pamphlets than composer. And so, because his polemical writings were so, how would I say, written in a very angry, almost hatred speech style, he had many enemies, and many people disliked him even before they had heard a note of his music. That was very, very characteristic. In fact, all the theoretical writings of Wagner emerged just in these years, 1860s, and then later he did not publish so many books altogether. Wagner's Gesammelte Schriften is a full series of books. They fill one whole bookshelf in the home library, and almost in the turn of the century, almost every German bourgeois home should have Wagner's collected writings. I think almost no one read them, but that was another thing. They had just a symbolic value. So it was so that Wagner was well known by as a media figure. He was one of the first really great media figures, we could use this modern expression for his lifetime. But his life economically was disastrous still. It was totally desperate. Then came a change, namely, suddenly one nobleman came to his house, knocked the door, and announced that he was cavalier of Bavaria's king, Louis II. And Louis II gave a letter to Richard in which he expressed his high admiration since a young boy of Wagner's music, and he offered him money and just support living in any way in his hometown, Munich. And so Wagner's life changed quite radically with this rather unexpected event indeed. Now, I would like to speak more about Louis II in chapter of Wagnerism, because he was certainly one of the most perfect Wagnerians of the 19th century, to whom Wagner commissioned his operas, and who also premiered some of them in Munich, in performances which Wagner himself did not quite accept yet. And then it was by the support of Louis, he was able to start to this idea of Bayreuth, which was a small Bavarian town for which he planned to build a theater to perform exclusively his operas. So the budget of Bayreuth was taken from the Bavarian budget, plus Patronat Verein, so patronate association, which gathered just the donors for Wagner's purposes. And so started this huge plan of Bayreuth, and at the end, with the best architects of the time, at the end it was ready. 1874, there was opening of Bayreuth, which was the most remarkable event in the whole Europe of that time, we could say. So in the opening of Bayreuth, many kings and heads of states came, like of course the emperor of Germany and of course Louis II and many others, and also all the leading composers like French delegation, Camille Saint-Saëns, César Franck, Chausson, many others, and Tchaikovsky. I think Edvard Grieg was there, and Italian composers. Of Verdi, I remember exactly. Verdi and Wagner had a quite special relationship because, of course, Verdi as the greatest Italian opera composer, and then Wagner. They admired each other, but Verdi took a distance always. He never came close to Wagner. By the way, if you want to read about this, I recommend you the novel by Franz Werfel, the Austrian expressionist writer, entitled Verdi, in which he portrays Wagner's last year and last coming to Palermo, and then where Verdi does not meet him, but follows in theater secretly Wagner's company in the performance of his operas. So I mean, Verdi and Wagner. And then, of course, the Russian composers, Tchaikovsky. Wagner had been in Russia, by the way, in 1864, and appeared as a conductor and made some quite radical things, like as a conductor, Wagner was the first one who conducted orchestra face to orchestra. Earlier conductor had always faced to the audience, and so by turning back to the orchestra. Now he turned the conductor other way around so that the conductor could follow exactly what the musicians were doing. That was a big innovation. And he met Russian composers, but Rimsky-Korsakov did not get so positive impression, although he was, of course, admiring Wagner's orchestration. It was quite congenial. Much deeper was impact of Hector Berlioz when he conducted his huge orchestras in Petersburg. Anyway, Bayreuth was opened, and it was a big event. Tickets were sold out much before, and so it became a place of pilgrimage of all Wagnerians and opera lovers. And like nowadays, if you want to get a seat and ticket, you have to apply it for several years in advance. Also, the Americans came there in very early phase. There is a very funny story about these Bayreuth performances, how searched for they were. Namely, in 1911 was published in Berlin in a magazine a funny story by Mr. Müller and Schulze, who came from German countryside to visit Bayreuth, and how they finally did not ever get the tickets there, and how they finally never saw any opera of Ring, although they wished it. But instead it was a pilgrimage, and in the train already they meet one German professor who then tries to explain them how you should behave in Bayreuth in order to be accepted there. So this professor says, in order to make a good impact, you must have known Richard Wagner personally. You must have been in the first Fest performances in 1876, and you must have the membership fee for Patronat Association. You must have talked closely with Franz Liszt. You must have visited the Angermann restaurant, You must have had a life-dangerous adventure with an idiotical but robust anti-Wagnerian person. You must be able to speak about Jean-Paul. You must know by heart Liszt, Bülow, Wagner genealogy. You must have heard Professor Tode in Heidelberg. You must be able to read Edda, namely the old and new Icelandic Edda, and also the younger Edda, quite fluently. You must be able to differ Wolfram von Eschenbach from the old French troubadours. You must carry in your pocket the Leitmotif guide by Wolfsogen. You must whistle in every 5 minutes one Leitmotif. You must alliterate. You must be able to make comparisons between Wagner, Aeschylus, and Michelangelo. You must be a member of Parsifal Verein. You must look a little bit Jewish. You must correct person who says Walküre instead of Walküre. You must have dined at least once intimately with one Rhine daughter. So these were the requirements. And then Mr. Müller says, oh, that's not difficult if you have enough knots in your handkerchief. But then professor says, oh, it's not enough. My lesson, the second part, concerns with Bayreuth you have to know. You must know that the arpeggiated E-flat major chord in Rhinegold lasts 136 measures. You must know that the giants and dwarfs are personifications of some principles. You must note that Siegfried Wagner conducts by his left hand. You must know that between Tannhäuser and Tristan, Wagner used Atlas morning coat. You must note that in Villa Frauenin there is no hypothek. You must know that earlier in Bayreuth no cars were allowed, but now they are permitted, but their signals are tuned to blow Wagnerian leitmotifs. You must notice that in the year 1913, Masters' output will be liberated, and then at that moment there will be at least 30 Wagner theaters which all perform Die lustige Witwe. Then Mr. Müller says, well, now we know enough, finally. Professor says, oh, you are just good traces only. But I forgot to tell that a modern Bayreuthian nowadays takes Richard Wagner already as a past standpoint, a kind of splendid kitsch, and that with which the operas like Salome, Elektra, and Rosenkavalier have already passed by. So there were also much humorous writing about Bayreuth, which otherwise was seen as something quite serious. Now, Wagner completed his life was very regular under Cosima, and Cosima portrays in his Tagebücher. But by the way, they never tell how Wagner composed. So now, although Wagner wrote enormous amount of texts, he was always worried about the philosophical content of his librettos and his plots. But he never spoke how technically he was composing. In fact, we find only in one essay, über die Aufwendung von Musik auf das Drama, one passage in which he quotes the Elsa's aria from Lohengrin, which is illustrates the modulation through 7 tonalities and how that corresponds to certain poetical ideas which change. So that's almost only a place where we have a music example exactly. So Wagner's life focused very much on the events in Bayreuth. He was able himself to stage, direct, and conduct the first performances of Nibelungen Ring and Parsifal, and we have just this wonderful documentation by Heinrich Borges about these performances. So we know only 3 singers, Lili Lehmann, Marianne Brandt, and Hermann Winkelmann, were later recorded in that CD recording 100 years Wagner singing. But then they were already 30 years older than, so that we cannot have any exact image or how their voices were under Richard Wagner. But anyway, Bayreuth was not supported by Berlin, and so Richard was very dissatisfied with the whole new German regime and government. He met Bismarck, but Bismarck said after that, that is the most ambitious man I have ever seen. What does that Richard Wagner want of me, after all? So in one moment, Wagner even planned to go to the United States, to Minnesota, where he had his admirers. Louis II, of course, was a man who funded everything, and he had rather sad end of his life as a Wagnerian, but I shall tell about that more in the chapter about Wagnerism. Wagner, they used to travel to Italy because of his health. His health was deteriorating. He had always breast anguish and ache, so some heart problems were diagnosed. And in fact, they were in Palermo, where he got a heart attack and he died of it, and then that was the end of his life. So later in Palermo there are at least 10 hotels who had a plaque, Richard Wagner died here, so it was made a kind of business in that sense. So that was his life story, and of course the family continued the tradition. Cosima, who lived until 1931, and his son Siegfried. The daughters were not active in this sense, but Siegfried became very active as the main person conducting together with Cosima the festivals of Wagner. But then they both passed away in the same year. Only when Cosima had died, then Siegfried died just some months later. So mother and son. And then what remained were just the other daughters of Richard and Cosima. One was married with Houston Stuart Chamberlain, a British Wagnerian who wrote also a biography of Wagner. And then there were other admirers, Wagnerians like Bernard Förster, who was married with sister of Friedrich Nietzsche, who wrote his famous Klänge aus Parsifal, in which he proposed the Aryan race and vegetarianism. But I shall tell more about this, what happened with this under Winifred, and later maybe towards the end of my lecture series.